So today we're talking about Stairmaster, the infamous leaked episode of Nightmare Night and its various activities. The one that came out early because of a last-minute schedule change, and the various notes that didn't make it between the network and the distributor. So some fans saw this episode early and some will be seeing it now. I was one of the ones who saw it early because I couldn't guarantee what I would be doing with my free time when Halloween rolled around. And thankfully this is a Nightmare Night episode and the CMC were well in costume. Otherwise we would have all been spoiled on one of the best episodes ever of the series, and the CMC getting their cutie marks. Anyhow, this episode we see Fluttershy as she spends her days alone in her house on Nightmare Night because she's afraid to have any visitors or to step outside of her house during this time of the year. It seems something about Nightmare Night has made Fluttershy even more Fluttershy than usual. I mean, this is a Fluttershy that reminds me of what she was back in Dragonshy. Not the Fluttershy that has evolved and improved over time. We are now back to Fluttershy being literally afraid of every little ridiculous thing. Perhaps it's Nightmare Night that does this to her. And just like being around dragons, being on the day that she's afraid of makes her even more afraid than normal. Whether she's hiding from the pranksters and all of the jokes that could be pulled on her, like Granny Smith and the little stories she told, or whether Fluttershy has legitimate reasons to be afraid. Maybe some supernatural magic is in Equestria that makes Nightmare Night particularly scary, is not particularly touched upon, but for most of this episode we have to suffer through Fluttershy being overly Fluttershy. Anyhow, because the animals need to eat, she has to go out and get some food. After a run-in with Granny Smith, who delights in tormenting Fluttershy, she ends up in the castle, where she runs into Spike, who encourages her to hang out with her friends. Her friends encourage her to go to a party. Fluttershy's attempt to enjoy the party only results in the party being a bad experience. When Twilight suggests that Fluttershy become the one to do the staring as opposed to being stared, Fluttershy attempts to scare her friends at a haunted tea party. The tea party doesn't go over very well, but does some interesting character building by revealing Fluttershy's love for whatever the equestrian equivalent of anime would be. Perhaps manga, or perhaps some kind of stage production, whatever, bona fide versions of popular anime characters. Which I have to admit is kind of awesome and eerily close to Timmy Sparkle's prediction that Fluttershy would go to Japan and do all this anime stuff. Anyhow, with Fluttershy's attempts to scare her friends having failed, she's encouraged to give it one more try. And this time she has success, as she dresses up her animal friends and gets them to run through the Apple family corn maze, where they successfully scare the friends with all kinds of extra spooky imagery. The friends get scared all over the maze, see lots of gruesome stuff happening. A few of these events are set up ahead of time through foreshadowing. All along the way we see some interesting background pony costumes, and then we have the climax of the event where Fluttershy comes out dressed as Flutterbat, and she zips around scaring her friends. Perhaps traumatized by the memory of an actual event is what adds to the fear, or perhaps Fluttershy is legitimately scary, especially after all of the other monster encounters. Interesting that the 6 run from these creatures as opposed to trying to fight back, but regardless, we end up with Fluttershy eventually revealing that this whole thing was just her trying to scare her friends. And her friends actually enjoyed being scared and had a lot of fun with what Fluttershy was doing, and they actually enjoyed the scares and the chase and the weird creatures. They want her to do it again next year, but Fluttershy realizes that her element of kindness makes her way too uncomfortable scaring her friends, and she simply did not enjoy it. She was able to prove that she could face her fears and she could enjoy Nightmare Night, but that she just didn't want to. Interesting moral to walk away with. Couple of interesting notes to think about. A lot of great background costumes from the background characters, especially Derpy. The main 6's costumes were also expanding upon the lore of the world. Everything from Rarity's mermaid costume to Rainbow Dash's astronaut suit definitely gives us an idea of what kinds of things exist out in Equestria. Some of these costumes could even be considered callbacks to other episodes, like Applejack dressed as the Cowardly Lion from Wizard of Oz, when that was also visually referenced during the Manhattan Toto Pinel episode. Twilight dressed in armor, possibly a reference to her enjoyment of historical figures like Star-Swirl the Bearded. And Pinkie Pie dressed up in a costume that involves roller skates, possibly a reference to the third Equestria Girls movie where she also roller skates. Spike's costume was basically his costume from last year with a second head attached. So it was great with foreshadowing. We had the spider introduced in this episode, and we saw it use its webbing. Then we saw that same webbing used later on. And the Flutterbat costume was also referenced as one of the costumes on the costume rack. So that was also set up as something we knew Fluttershy had access to later on. The moral was an interesting one, considering that it was preaching that Fluttershy, it's perfectly okay for her to stay home and not participate in events. That just because you can do something doesn't mean you have to. Considering Rainbow Dash's costume, it's also interesting to think that sci-fi is canon in Equestria. And considering Rarity's costume, it's interesting to think that it's canon that mermaids exist. And when we see the ponies TPing the tree out in the yard there, it also makes us realize that toilet paper is canon in Equestria, and I prefer not to overthink that. It was a really neat opportunity to see the CMC in costume as well. Scootaloo dressed as the Wonderbolt was especially fascinating. And it was a mixed blessing that the CMC were in full costume and their cutie marks weren't visible. Since this was a leaked episode, it was really nice and really lucky not to have that bit of information spoiled for us. Overall, I considered the episode to be more interesting with what it presented us through the different costumes all of the ponies were wearing, and the world building that it did through the background information, as opposed to what it was with the main story. As far as the main story goes, it was a bit annoying seeing how Fluttershy was being. She was at her most Fluttershy she's ever been in the series, with the exception of possibly Dragonshy. And I really didn't like that presentation of her character. Not quite bad enough to call this a bad episode, but I imagine the community will probably have negative reactions to what they saw, while everybody else is going to be kind of sitting on their reactions, waiting for the rest of the world to catch up before we can hear their reviews, as was my case. Anyhow, that's all the thoughts I have for this for now. Thank you for watching, and good night.